when you're crafting a villain, don't set out to create a bad person, set out to create a good person and then destroy them beyond repair. So you're like finding this moment in their past, or maybe a lot of moments that are like slow reaffirmations where they are choosing their misbelief and going on that negative decline, like you were saying, that negative path towards their ultimate destruction.
We're sisters, best friends, and authors on a mission to help you stoke your creative fire and live the life of your dreams. We believe that purpose fuels passion and that creativity is your secret weapon for mass construction. There's never been a better time to bless the world with your dream realized. You're listening to The Kate and Abbie Show.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of The Kate and Abbie Show. Today we are talking about writing a heartbreaking villain's backstory. Villains are complex characters and sometimes very difficult to write, but when they are well written, they can be so powerful and emotional and really tug on our heartstrings and make us care about a character that maybe isn't necessarily a good character, but is very deeply conflicted. And all of that juicy conflict, their internal conflict, which then leads to the external conflict of the story, comes from their backstory. It comes from their past, where they came from, what made them into a villain. That's the big question when you're crafting a villain. So we're going to break down this process in today's episode and discuss how to make your villain more human and real and relatable and conflicted by looking to their backstory and crafting a history for your villain that makes their present day make so much sense. So if you're ready to dive into this discussion, we invite you to keep listening, keep watching, because this is going to be a really fun topic. But before we get into this episode, we first have to thank our amazing patrons, our sponsors. You're the ones who make this show possible. We so appreciate your support. So if you get value out of this podcast, go to patreon.com/The Kate and Abbie Show and help us keep this podcast alive and free of interruptions. Also, each month on the Patreon, we have a special live stream hangout session with me and Kate discussing our writing projects and getting updates from you guys on your writing projects. It's a super fun, chill hangout. We hope to see you there. All tier levels have access to that live stream, so make sure you get in on the Patreon to access that. And we will leave the link below this video. So let's get into the discussion. First things first, with writing a villain and their backstory, crafting their backstory, is to make them real and human. And I think this is something that a lot of writers, when they start thinking about a villain, it's not the first thing that comes to mind, to make them really human.
Right.
You know, you're thinking, oh, this is a bad person. They've become, you know, this corrupted, twisted person over time. But behind all of that, behind that mask, really, they are a human at heart.
Exactly. Yeah, and that element has to be there in order for them to feel believable.
Yeah.
And also to some extent relatable. Not that someone will be able to relate to, you know, the devious acts that the villain is doing, but we need to somehow see the humanity behind them. We need to see like what happened there.
Yeah.
What's going on behind the scenes. Exactly. Rather than just, oh, they're evil because they're evil because they're evil and there's no reason why any of this is happening. It's just the plot needs it to be there. The plot needs them to be this wicked person. Well, how did they get there? Because a lot of times, you know, it's small decisions or maybe pivotal moments in someone's life that defined them, or that they allowed to define them, that we've also faced. And maybe we've even struggled with, you know, pivotal moments in our own lives when we could have made a right or wrong decision, or a decision that led us on a more, you know, redemptive path or a more destructive path. These are all very basic human things that we all face in our everyday lives. Yeah. So if we can draw on some of those to bring out the color and the vision and the life in the villain's backstory, we can make our readers care about them more. And even if we don't want them to care about them in a good way necessarily, but it makes the reader engage more. They're going to be more engaged. They're going to be more interested to see like, oh, okay, this is really interesting. Where is this going? And I've yet to meet a reader that doesn't love a good villain inception story. I mean, think of all the series and books you've seen where they'll even go on to do spin-offs about the villains and the inception story of the villain, because that's how much the readers want to see more of how did they get there.
Right, exactly. It's so important. And I think that when you're writing a villain from this perspective of like, okay, we can go back to their past. If you go back far enough, you're going to meet them, as a child. And when they were a child, what maybe happened in their past then to set them on this path. Maybe they weren't set on the path as a child, or maybe it was later on in life. But if you go back far enough, you meet them at a place where they could have potentially been a hero or could have potentially been a good character. And so finding that pivotal moment in that character's past, I think, is a really good place to start. Is like, okay, rewind the clock, and where do we get to that point where they are just an ordinary human like any other hero of the story, and maybe if they made different decisions, they could have potentially become a protagonist instead of an antagonist. And really, in their own minds, they're kind of the hero of their own story, but they're going about getting what they want in all the wrong ways. And I think that when you can sort of look at your protagonist and your antagonist and see the humanity in both of them, it helps to really make them both relatable to your reader. Like you were saying, maybe your reader can't relate to like the bad things that the antagonist is doing, but we can relate to the conflict that they're dealing with, because we all have conflicts. We all have desires and fears that clash with each other.
Right, and it's more those individual choices.
Right.
Because that kind of combats this idea that, they're just pure evil. They're pure evil for pure evil's sake, and there's really no rhyme or reason to why they behave like that other than the fact that the plot needs it. Right. It really roots back to all these little individual choices they've made where they've chosen the shadow side. And those are all moments that we can relate to. It's just that the villain of the story, rather than the protagonist, has chosen the shadow side more often, and it's shaped them more in their journey. In some ways, in some stories, it's very drastic. In other stories, it's going to be more subtle. We were just discussing this. Depending on what genre you're writing, you could be working with a villain in a contemporary that's really not that bad of a person, right? It doesn't always have to be, this insane fantasy, wizard, witch, vampire, whatever. It's not always going to be this big epic evil thing. It might just be someone who's bitter about life, or someone who has chosen to, hide themselves away from the world and think badly of other people and whatever. So it's really, all of it roots back to those individual choices of choosing the shadow side over the alternative, which would be to go on a more upwardly progressive journey for their character arc.
Exactly. So true. I always like to think of it like, when you're crafting a villain, don't set out to create a bad person, set out to create a good person and then destroy them beyond repair. So you're finding this moment in their past, or maybe a lot of moments that are slow reaffirmations where they are choosing their misbelief and going on that negative decline, like you're saying, that negative path towards their ultimate destruction. Which kind of leads us to our second point, which is to show us their desires, fears, and misbeliefs. And I talk about this a lot on my channel with crafting your protagonist and your good characters as well, the characters who are on noble missions to achieve their goals and do the right thing. And characters who are not doing the right thing also have their own desires, fears, and misbeliefs. And so diving into that mixture of internal conflict is really what's going to set up your villain for having this really relatable, realistic personality and momentum in the story. Having that, figuring out, okay, what is it they want? What specifically does that look like? What is their goal that they're trying to accomplish? And a lot of times their goal intersects with the protagonist's goal and creates obstacles in the protagonist's path, depending on how your villain and your hero are interacting with each other.
Right. And that adds a layer to their humanity too.
Right.
Because now we understand why the villain is doing what they're doing. That's something that I think I've seen a lot of readers get frustrated over, is when it's like, oh, I don't really understand why the villain's doing any of this. There's really no clear motive. It's just that there needs to be some sort of bad force for the hero to go up against. So we're really just using the villain as this barometer for measuring the hero against, rather than giving them a persona and a reason and a motive and fears and desires. Like really understanding, okay, this is their battle plan. And like Abbie was saying, here's how it intersects and butts up against the hero's own plans. And that's when we have those moments of like explosive conflict.
Yeah.
Is where those journeys are intersecting.
Exactly. Yeah, I feel like a lot of stories where the villain falls flat, it's like they have a goal maybe, but they don't have a motive. And the same goes for stories where the protagonist falls flat or the other characters fall flat, is they have a goal like, okay, yeah, we're pursuing this thing, we need to do this thing, but they don't really have a deep motive behind why they're trying to do it. Right. So, the same goes for every character in your book, especially if they're a main character getting a lot of screen time. We have to know what is the deeper reason why they're doing this.
Right.
What is it they feel they lack? What is it that they are hungry for? What is their fatal flaw, basically? Because that's kind of where all of it stems from, is the fatal flaw, the misbelief. What they believe, what they mistakenly believe is true about themselves and about the world. And you can, use things like my character profile, which I will link up here in the corner, or my make a misbelief template, which I can also link up here in the corner. Those are processes, like those are techniques to create your protagonist, but it can be a technique to create your antagonist too. It doesn't matter what kind of character you're creating. If you are trying to craft a character who is flawed and realistic and relatable and human, they have to have desires and fears and misbeliefs and goals that they're actively pursuing. And in that way, villains really aren't that much different than heroes.
Right.
They're just, like you're saying, they're embracing their shadow side more. And so their goal even could be very similar or the same as your hero's goal, but the way they're pursuing it is totally different. And that's what makes them more of the antagonist force.
Right, which we talked about this in a past episode of the show, which is actually one of our most popular episodes about crafting unforgettable villains. And you can check that out with the link below. We can link it. But we talked about different examples in literature and TV series where you can really see that at play, where you have the hero and the villain actually have similar goals and are actually maybe even similar in personality, but it's more the choices that they're making that are defining them and setting them apart from each other.
Right. Yes, very true. Very good point. Before we continue on to our next point here, I want to take a quick sec to pause and tell you guys about the super special summit that me and Kate are going to be doing this March. And I'm going to let Kate kind of take the wheel with it, because you know way more about it, because it is your Muse Challenge Summit that you host every single month. And this month I'm going to be joining Kate because we're going to be discussing villains in this summit in more detail.
Yeah, so this summit is the anatomy of a villain summit. So if you guys so far are enjoying this episode and you're like, yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to do, is craft a really memorable, terrifying, spine-chilling villain that's going to stay with your reader long after they shut the final page of your book, you're not going to want to miss this summit that Abbie and I are doing together on Muse Challenge, which is a beautiful initiative for writers. It's an incredible, lively community. We get together every single month, and all you have to do to join is go to my Patreon, which is patreon.com/KAMNs, and join at the Muse Summit level. That's not only going to give you access to this upcoming summit about villains with Abbie and I, but it's also going to give you access to the archive of the past summits as well. So you'll be getting access to a previous training that Abbie and I did together, as well as some other really dynamic teachings as well. But in this summit coming up, we're going to be delving into how to create powerful and spine-chillingly memorable villain inception stories. We all love those. Crafting realistic and deeply human internal conflicts for your villain, curating believable and high-stakes motives, how to hide your villain in plain sight and totally shock your readers, how to craft a dynamic relationship between the hero and the villain, and how to create epic and compelling redemptive arcs and memorable tragedies. So this is going to give you the full toolkit, really, on how to craft a dynamic villain. And Abbie and I have spent so much time talking about this, not only here on the podcast and in past episodes, but together in our own writing as we've written together. We've written such a plethora of different types of fiction, from contemporary to fantasy to urban fantasy and action and suspense, really being able to compress all of that and see the nuts and bolts of what makes a great villain no matter what type of story you're writing. So you're not going to want to miss this summit. You're going to want to register for it with the link below. It takes place Saturday, March 15th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you can't make the summit while it's happening, the replay will be available permanently within the Patreon after it has happened.
Yes. So make sure you click the link below to save your spot. And we cannot wait to see you guys at the summit. It's going to be super fun. I love talking about villains, obviously, with how many videos I've made about villains.
Yes.
Me and Kate both love discussing villains. So this, like Kate said, this is going to be like your full toolkit that you need to craft a relatable and unforgettable villain that will have your readers thinking about them forever and maybe even falling in love with them a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Loving to hate them.
Yes.
We all love
bit of both.
to hate villains.
We want both of those things going on.
Yes. So
For sure.
Make sure you save your spot, click the link below, sign up, register, and while you're waiting for this summit to happen on March 15th, you can go back and watch the previous Muse Challenge summits and get into the Facebook group and connect with the community. You'll love it there. So click the link below, and we can't wait to see you on March 15th for that. Okay, let's get back into our points for writing a heartbreaking villain's backstory. Next up is to ask yourself, how did this villain become the way they are? And this is kind of what we've been saying this whole time, like really sitting down, and you can even imagine, I like to imagine sometimes when I'm brainstorming my characters that I'm like taking them into a therapy and I'm the therapist and they're sitting on the couch and I'm questioning them about their past and their flaws and their misbeliefs and their traumas and things that they've gone through in life that have turned them into the person they are today. And that's basically what it is. And you can kind of like talk yourself through it and imagine that you're talking to your character. And what do you think they would say if you started asking them some of these questions? Like, why do you believe what you believe? Why do you want what you want? Where do you think that desire came from? When in your past did you start believing that this thing was true about yourself, or that you needed this, or that you lacked this? Did you feel like you were missing something when you were growing up that now you want this thing badly because you felt like you missed out on it when you were young? All these questions can sort of start to decipher and solve the mystery of how your villain has gotten to the place where they are today.
Right.
And of course, you can do this with any character, but I think it's especially important for villains because we can all kind of understand like the motivation to do something good, and heroic or noble or helpful. But the motivation to do something bad or corrupt or twisted or wicked is definitely a little more complicated. So getting, unpicking the complicated threads of that, I think starts with looking to the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the villain is one of the most important characters in your story because they're really a huge part. They're like 50% of what's driving the story forward, if not more so, because usually the hero is reacting and setting out on a journey that has been laid out in part because of what the villain is doing.
Right.
They're having to maneuver around what the villain is planning and plotting, even if it's a contemporary, even if it's just an antagonistic force or energy. So this is a big part of your story that if you removed it, you wouldn't have a plot. Most of your plot would be gone. So we have to really give some time and attention and care to how did they become like this? Why are they making these choices? Understanding why they are making these choices. And like Abbie was saying, like be the therapist for your villain. Figure out like when did those things start? And it can even be helpful to, and I know Abbie's done this a lot, is like write pieces of backstory, even if you're not going to include them in your book, just so that you as the author can walk through that part of your villain's life. You can see where these toxic threads were beginning to be woven. We can see how it was impacting them. We can see how it was transforming them in their journey. And we have all those back notes for ourselves so that when we show up to write, chapter 1 or chapter 10, whatever it is, we have we already know what they've been through. So we can write from that experience feeling like we know them. We know how they got this way.
Yes, I agree. That is so powerful, and it's so helpful. Like you said, even if you don't use the actual portions of backstory that you wrote, it's good for you to know that, and also for you to even reference it, because you might find some unique ways to sprinkle in bits and pieces of it without going to a whole flashback. You might find ways to just capture a single moment in their past or a pivotal choice they made, and capture that almost as this isolated flashback that's like a snapshot. It's not really a full flashback. It's more like a snapshot of all these pieces of their past that made them who they are today. And you might even find a effortless way to sprinkle those into your present day story, so that as you are revealing your villain to your readers, they're seeing a glimpse of their thought process in their mind.
Right.
They're seeing what that villain is remembering about their past. Because a lot of times we don't hit pause on our present lives to go into a full-blown memory in linear order. But we will remember maybe a tiny flashback or snapshot from our past of, some trauma that happened to us, or a time that, our feelings were hurt or somebody betrayed us. So those little flashes of conflict from the past that you can show us, that you can shine a spotlight on once in a while in the present day, will show your reader how your villain got to this place without going into a full-blown flashback, if you don't want to do that.
Right.
So that's a way to utilize the backstory scenes that you do write. But yeah, I think that just writing them for your own reference is also a great thing to have. It's a great tool to have in your toolkit, because you're approaching the villain from this place of familiarity now.
Right.
Where they've been, even if the reader doesn't know. And you writing them from that place of familiarity will help the reader to feel like they're more familiar with the character. They'll feel more lived in, even if you don't know everything that happened in their past.
Right.
Which kind of leads us to the next point, which is to use the Enneagram to craft meticulous past traumas for your villain. And the Enneagram is something that you've probably heard me talk about a lot in the past. And I just started posting a special 9-part series diving deep into the Enneagram on my channel. You can check out the first video for that right here. I just covered the type 1 last week or a couple weeks ago. And we're going to dive into each of the 9 Enneagram types even deeper. But the Enneagram is such an amazing, life-changing tool that has just been a game changer for me as a person and as a writer. But it has helped me so much to craft characters that are human and relatable and conflicted, and to really just give me a springboard for good internal conflicts and beliefs. And I think that it's a really great way for writers to start crafting not just good characters, not just protagonists, but also villains. And in the Enneagram series, I'm kind of diving into the bright side and the shadow side of each type and each subtype. And by bright side and shadow side, I basically mean a character who's on a positive growth path versus a character who is on a negative fall path. So if they're on a negative character arc, they're kind of descending towards their lie, accepting their lie as truth, oftentimes the case with a villain. And if they are a protagonist, usually they're kind of trying to combat their misbelief and their fatal flaw, and ultimately growing and improving as a character towards a positive growth path. But of course, it depends on whatever kind of story you're writing, what kind of character you're writing. But with a villain, and with any character really, it's so amazing how you can really use the Enneagram as a shortcut to get to the beliefs of your character, and to dig down into the specific childhood trauma that happened to them that turned them into their personality today. Right. So in the type 1 video, we discussed the perfectionist and the critic and the avenger. And these are all like the subtypes of the Enneagram 1, and looked at how in the shadow side, they can manifest as villain characters or as self-destructive characters when they embrace their lie. And looking to the past, looking at, okay, what maybe happened in the past to turn this person into who they are today, we can easily see that all those things that happened in the past, you could like grow from it, or you could let it destroy you.
Right.
So depending on your character and what path they're on, maybe they grow from it, maybe they learn from it, maybe they become a better person because of it, or maybe they let it destroy them and they become like the victim of what happened to them. And I think that's something that, I don't know if that's explored a whole lot with a lot of villains, is like the fact that they're kind of the victim of what happened to them in the past.
Right. I love that.
They don't overcome
so much more dynamic. It's not just, I want to do this evil thing because I want to do this evil thing. It's like, well, how did they get there? And what was the first trigger that set them on that path? What was that pivotal moment like? And what I find unique about the Enneagram is that it can really help you differentiate what those different things could be based on their personality. So not every character ends up sounding the same. And you can really make their voice and their own issues very unique to them.
Yes, so true. And that leads us to the final question to ask yourself, which is, why did this villain embrace their shadow side? Right. So looking to the Enneagram, you can see what each type, what their shadow side is like, and how the flip side of all these strengths can easily become weaknesses. They can become obstacles that trip your character up. And so just looking to their past and asking yourself, okay, what were those moments that they had a decision to make? They came to a crossroads, they encountered an obstacle, or somebody hurt them, or someone betrayed their trust, and they decided to choose the path that is towards stress and destruction, and not the path towards growth and forgiveness. And when you can define those moments and pinpoint those moments and flesh out that backstory, even if it's just for yourself, you'll find that you have laid the groundwork for a heartbreaking villain backstory that makes sense and that makes it very understandable.
Yes.
Maybe not justifiable, but understandable.
Yeah.
Of why they became the person.
It gives them a clear journey.
Right.
Whether you're going on a redemptive arc or a tragic arc, which is something we'll be discussing in the Muse Challenge Summit upcoming. But like, no matter what you do, it makes it so much more 3D rather than just having this 2D villain that's evil and angry for no reason.
Yes, 100%. So hopefully you guys took some notes. Hopefully you found this discussion helpful. Just to recap real quick, make your villain human and real. Show us their desires, fears, and misbeliefs. Ask yourself, how did they become the way they are? Use the Enneagram to craft past traumas, and ask yourself, why did they embrace their shadow side? And if you want to take your villain to that next level and make them even more conflicted and relatable and unforgettable, you don't want to miss the upcoming Muse Challenge Summit that's happening March 15th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We hope to see you guys there. Make sure you click the link below this video to save your spot, get in the Muse Challenge on Kate's Patreon, and we cannot wait to see you guys there. And thank you again to our patrons of the Kate and Abbie Show for helping us to keep this show alive and free of interruptions. We so appreciate you guys, so appreciate your support. If you get value out of this podcast, go to patreon.com/the Kate and Abbie Show and help us keep it going. Okay, guys, thank you for listening. Until next time,
stay stoked
and rock on.